call. This is February 24th, 2021. It is a special meeting of the Village of Lake Bluff Historic Preservation Commission to discuss proposed changes to the historic preservation regulations and a process that we intend to follow. Hopefully get some good feedback, discuss our feedback, and get some additional feedback. But before we start, Glenn, if you could call the roll, please.
Certainly. Member Bergman.
Here.
Member George, I believe, is still absent. Member Liebold is absent. Member Minor.
Here.
Member Nickel.
Here.
Vice Chair Richardson.
Here.
And Chair Kraus.
Here we have a quorum, and hopefully our other members will show up in a little bit. We have a hard stop at 8 o'clock. One member needs to drop off the video and go to an audio only at 7:30, but I would like to propose a hard stop at 8 o'clock tonight for this meeting. Agenda item number 2, as is the policy of the Historic Preservation Commission, we provide an opportunity at the beginning of each meeting for members of the audience, either members in person or virtual members, to ask questions of or make a presentation to the Historic Preservation Commission on an item that is not on tonight's agenda and that falls within our purview. Do we have anyone from the audience who would like to address the commission?
Yes, so we have, at least on Zoom, 19 viewers with us this evening. I am seeing one person who wishes to speak, Miss Tricia Brockett. Tricia, you're able to speak as soon as you would like to unmute your microphone.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hi. Thanks. I just received information about the meeting from my neighbors because my address and my neighbor's addresses were listed as part of the historic preservation. And I had a couple questions preliminarily about that, if you don't mind hearing me out. Number one is, what do you propose for the updates if our house was to be put in that significant status? And number two is, will there be any adjustments to property taxes?
Okay. The answer to number 2 is no. At this point, we are proposing to the village board that they consider, for properties that are landmarked, a tax reduction or a tax freeze if there are significant modifications made to a building. But there's certainly, those are under discussion, but we're not proposing any specific either tax implications for our proposal. So that's number 2. Number 1, so I'll address this to everyone in the audience. The list has gotten been a lot of chatter. I haven't seen them chatter about historic preservation for a while. All good. The list that was produced, every structure on that list has been already identified as a significant structure in the village of Lake Bluff by Susan Benjamin and Associates, which are the consultants that the village has used. They're professional historic preservation consultants. Over the course of more than 15 years, actually 13 years, the village retained Benjamin and Associates 4 times, 1998, 2003, 2008, and most recently 2019, to survey every structure within the village and to identify, within the context of historic preservation, to identify those structures that are deemed to be significant to the cultural, social, intellectual, architectural history of Lake Bluff. And those are what are listed in the handout. They also have identified certain structures that are contributing to the ambiance of Lake Bluff, and then by default, structures that are not contributing to the village. So your structure is already considered a significant structure within the village. Before I answer what our update process is, let me get to one of the agenda items here is, what are we going to do with this list? So what we are going to do, this is the listing of significant structures within the village. We've identified on this list structures that have already been landmarked, structures that are within a historic district, a federal district, structures that have been individually placed as a landmark with the federal government, structures that have been demolished, and then because there is a lot of interest with the History Museum's Distinguished Home Award, which is a totally separate, we're not responsible for that, but a lot of people know their home is a Distinguished Home Award, so we've identified those as well. So this is the beginning point. These are all significant structures. I love them all. The idea for the commission is to work through this list and to work with property owners who are interested in landmarking their property, to provide some education around the process, to talk about the benefits of landmarking, to talk about what happens if you are a landmark structure. And most specifically relevant to this structure is to identify and begin discussions very quickly with property owners around what I've been calling a double hint, 10, 20 potential structures that we think the village needs to do what it can to keep. So we think, and historic preservationists would agree that, I would assume, that there are anchor structures within a village that really define its character or are representative of the history of the village. What the goal of the Historic Preservation Commission is to provide the right environment for those homes to be maintained, for those homes to not be torn down, for those homes to be, as many of the owners of historic residents have already done, for those homes to be updated into the 21st century housing style. So that's what this is. In terms of what our updating process will be, we'll talk a little bit about this list at the end of tonight's meeting, but not a whole lot. We'll talk more about this list at our regularly scheduled meeting in March, which is March 10th, Wednesday, March 10th, 2 weeks from today. We will talk about this list, and I have more information around, and you can participate in that discussion. Was that responsive?
Yes, can you hear me again?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for your response. Those are our primary concerns. I'll just speak with more specificity for our property. We're already encompassed under a homeowners association who governs our architectural review. And so my feeling is that to have another governing board on top of that, I'm not sure that's necessary. Would that be more of a burden to these 5 homeowners in one subdivision that is already governed? So just something for your consideration moving forward.
Sure, and in general, I agree with you. I mean, what we're concerned about are for those anchor structures, for those villages that are symbols of Lake Bluff's history. We want those homes to be livable. Obviously, we want them to be places that people love to own and love to live in, but we want them to stay. We want them, if we can, through the homeowners, encouraging homeowners and working with them. We just don't want to see those homes go away. We don't want to put restrictive burdens on others, but we do feel that a neighborhood streetscape is important, and neighbors should have an opportunity to express an opinion on a potential teardown of a historic structure. We can get into more of that as we go forward, but thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
And since we've opened it up, Glenn, if there's anyone else in the audience, our 19 or 20 people who would want some opening comments or want some clarification of what we're doing, let's just deal with that right now.
Certainly. There's at least one more. I'm sure perhaps others will make themselves known. If you would allow me, I would add perhaps one additional point to your explanation.
Sure.
Yeah, so I've had a few conversations in recent days, and so I would just emphasize perhaps even more clearly that that significant list exists today. It's existed for some time. It has, unto itself, it has no importance, does not affect how you can use your property. It doesn't apply any restrictions to your property. It's just a list of properties that have been identified by a professional. Here in Lake Bluff, there are a small number of properties already identified as landmarks. Those are properties that are subject to a different, I would say, more stringent set of rules that requires public notice, that requires a public hearing, that requires meeting specific standards. It's not just applied arbitrarily in Lake Bluff. So again, I just wanted to emphasize that, you know, the existence of one house on a list doesn't mean anything changes based on the different processes being discussed tonight. Again, some landmarks already exist in the village. Most of these tools already exist in the village. What's under consideration is just changing numbers one way or another way, or perhaps changing some of the internal pieces of how they work. Really, the concept of a historic district is what I would say the only truly new concept under discussion in the HPC's past recommendation. So sometimes just wanted to be very clear about that for people that aren't as familiar with how we do preservation in Lake Bluff today.
Thank you. And if there are others who have questions or want some additional clarification, I'd appreciate that.
We do have at least one more person. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Thanks. My name is William Schwartz. I'm an owner of one of the properties on the list. You know, when we bought the house, we didn't know that it was historic. And we learned about it afterwards. And Stephen, I think I actually communicated with you about a plaque or something last year. Yeah. We just became aware of this process. You know, we didn't get the letter. I understand now there was some letter sent out. We did not receive it. And so I guess we're trying to understand. So now I understand that it sounds like there's two lists. I don't know which list we're on. I know we're on the one that's posted, but now there's another list. So I need to know if I'm on that list. But I guess, you know, what I'm trying to understand is for my property specifically, and we don't have to go into the details in this meeting, but I don't understand what the impacts are to us. I don't understand right now, you know, how we get a view of those restrictions, if there are any. I don't understand, you know, if we don't like them, can we get off the list? Because we didn't put ourselves on this list. We bought into something that, you know, was not disclosed to us, frankly. And we're concerned that if there are restrictions, frankly, that it will affect our values, because fewer people will want to buy it. And if fewer people want to buy it, then I don't want to invest in updating it. You see what I mean? So I'm trying to understand the impacts for us, because if I have a problem on the sell side, I'm not going to invest a lot of money into making it nicer. So I know that's a little bit of a you know, a diatribe and not so many questions, but I guess I would like to understand which list are we on? How do we get a view into any restrictions? And if we don't like being on the list, is there a way to get off the list?
All good questions, and thanks for the comments. There's only one list. It's the list that was attached to the information for this meeting. There are multiple parts of that list, but there's only one. There's a master list, and that's the only one we're talking about. So I'm not sure where the second list idea came from, but I can have Glenn run that down later. Can you get off the list? The list was, the village asked the outside consultants to identify those structures deemed to be significant in the village. That's all it is. It's simply, if you would, an honorarium, recognizing that the home has a historic, has a past, and whether that past is architectural, whether it's based on a certain kind of design, whether it's cultural, whether it's specifically because some people live there or interesting things happen there. Those are the pieces of information that we think property owners would be interested in, and those are pieces of information that we need to understand if, big if, there is anything other than having your home be a significant home within the village. So that leads to your last thing. What are the impacts and what are the restrictions? And we're going to get into more of that in our discussion later today. And we also have and can send out more information on actually what those impacts might be. But what we're trying to do is to identify a small number of anchor properties, a small number taken from this list. By the way, any property owner in Lake Bluff, we would love to talk about landmarking your home as part of the general course of business. That's what we like to do. We like to talk about home's history and go through landmarking so that there's some degree of future protection, especially in face of a teardown. I should also say that we're not interested in interior at all. People can do what they wish with the interior. We are less interested in the exterior. We're interested in the streetscape, in how the home presents itself to its place, to its neighbors, its neighborhood context. But we're interested in looking at the potential, having discussions with property owners for those anchor structures, hopefully voluntarily, homeowners voluntarily would landmark their property. If not, potentially the village could. The village has the authority to do that. We don't want to do that. We want this to be voluntary. But candidly, we feel there are some structures in the village that the maximum protection allowed by the Village of Lake Bluff ordinances needs to be in place, especially to encourage teardowns. We've all gone through that process of having a home. I assume we all have. I have many times. I've lived here for a long time. Having a home that I admired and liked, seeing a contractor turn up at the door in the morning, thinking that's great, they're going to redo the house, come back from work in the evening, and the house is gone. We are looking to get community input into those kinds of decisions. So without going into a lot of detail here, the things to think about are what is the impact of a landmark? If I am landmarked, there are potential benefits. There's potential tax credits and potential fee waivers that are involved in landmarking a home and remodeling it. The biggest negative that most people have identified correctly is that the potential for if you or a future property owner wants to tear down a landmark, the village can impose a demolition delay that currently is 180 days, and we are recommending that be increased to 365 days, but only for landmark properties. And again, I don't want to get way into the weeds on that process.
So can I just have a quick follow-up, if you don't mind?
You should.
Yeah. The two lists came from, I heard there was a federal list that was more restrictive. I think your fellow in the Village Hall boardroom said that. And then there's this list. So it sounds like that maybe I misinterpreted that.
So there you can go online under National Register of Historic Places, and you can sort by Illinois, and it comes a zip or an alpha list. You'll find all of the national landmarks that are identified on that list. They are all of them are included in our significant list, identified as either a landmark or either as a district or as an individual structure on the National Landmark List. So there is, if that's the list you mean, yes, there is another national list. There's also a state list. There's all kinds of lists. But the one we're concerned about is the list that was attached to the
okay, and then my second follow-up is the prior owner, as I learned from you, actually made an application for this, right? Okay. So you sent me a legal document. It was fairly lengthy. I have not read it all yet, but what does that put us into? Does that put us into, I guess, so are we we're an official landmark property, right? But it's not like your consultant didn't pick this property. The prior owner actually applied for it and granted it, is my understanding.
So, let me check. Hang on 1 second here, so I know what I'm doing.
It's 271 Ravine.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a landmark.
Okay. Yep, so your house is a landmark, and you're subject to a higher level of scrutiny. If you would wish to tear the structure down, or if you would wish to make a significant change defined as 50% of the exterior wall space.
Is
So
that the proposal, or is that today's rule?
that's today's rule.
Okay, that was not.
And the only thing that we are proposing is to increase the delay periods. The tear down from 180 to 365 is the one that grabs most people's attention. But the future, now,
Well, Steve, could
go ahead.
could I just, oh, go ahead, Margaret.
Well, I was just going to say, there's also the initiative from HPC to create transparency to the information about these homes and creating that database, that online access. Would you want to talk about that? Because that eliminates the need for lists and all of that.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about it?
No.
I need to interrupt here for just a second.
Yeah.
While we're talking about lists, because a comment was made like a question and a half ago about there being a more restrictive federal list. And I want to very carefully emphasize that if your house is listed on the National Historic Register, and we have a handful of houses in town that are listed on the National Historic Register, there is no limitation, there is no restriction on what you do with the properties. And so you'll hear me say this on a regular basis. If your house is listed on the National Historic Register, that is in Washington as part of the National Park Service, you can get your house listed on the National Historic Register on Monday, and you can bring in the bulldozer on Tuesday. There is no limitations. The limitations that occur regarding lists are local. And so what we're talking about are property owners' rights limitations that occur for local landmarking. And it sounds like this homeowner lives in a house that is already landmarked. So you automatically get a ticket to come and see us at the HPC.
I have a couple of questions I see in the question box. I'll get to those in just a second. I do want to follow up with what Margaret said. One of our goals is to have every, certainly current property owner, but also when an individual is looking to buy in Lake Bluff, that there is an easy way to find out the history of that home. And we're designing what we initially are calling Lake Bluff Online, where every home within the village, you can go through an online portal and look at any structure within the village, and you will find if it is considered a significant structure, you'll actually see the survey form that the Benjamin surveyors produced during their surveys. You'll have information about when the house was built. You'll have some information, or if we can input it appropriately, that we get from the county, which includes a lot of interesting information for potential new buyers. And importantly, information around potential landmark status. So our goal is that everyone in the village will have quick and easy access to the information that our last questioner was asking for. I didn't know. We've heard a lot. I didn't know that my home was considered to be historic, or that it was important for the history of the village.
Yeah.
So we're working on that. That's part of this initiative. Give us a few more months to be able to get that up and running.
Okay, and then I'll stop, but I just, I would like to understand at some point the benefit that you see in this delay of doubling it, because I don't understand it. And you don't have to address that now, because I know you have a meeting to run, but I just don't understand why you would impose that on people.
Okay.
I really don't. It's only going to hurt my property value and make me want to do less with my house, right? So I'm a good steward of the house. We want to be a good steward. We want to invest in it, but we're not going to if we are going to be afraid we're not going to be able to sell it. So that's the message I would like to land. I will stop, and you all can continue your meeting. Thank you very much for the.
And we'll get to that a little bit later.
Okay.
So let me go through. I've got 4 open questions here. Will every household on the list be formally notified? Certainly the ones that we want to have discussions about landmarking. I think it is, those would, if we prioritize them, those would be first, but I think the answer is yes. I think that in the fairly near future, we will contact all of the households that are on this list, at least to let them know they're on the list, and to hopefully initiate a conversation around the history of their home. We have done this a number of times in the past, and have had some good discussions with property owners, but so we'll be doing that. Another question, what's the designation of Paul's 2019 list mean? So we've been doing this for a long time. We've been doing this for 3 years. And Member Bergman in 2019 began the process of looking at some structures that he wanted to talk more about. So that's an initial subset of homes that the commission will be looking at based on Member Bergman's suggestions. We have a number of other suggestions from some of the commissioners, but that's what that is. It's a remnant of other work. And Glenn, you wanted to amplify that?
As far as the nature of the lists or the Paul's prior work, on which item?
I just have a note here that says you would like to answer this question live, but I guess I've answered it, so I'll let you.
That's just marking the questions as we're going through them.
Okay. So here's another question. Is the HPC really consider the idea of providing incentives as opposed to penalties to encourage preservation? Yep, we have. Our proposal will include a series of suggestions to the village board around enhancements, including, but not limited to, potential local property tax freezes and potential other financial incentives. We now have a reduced building permit fee, perhaps that in the right circumstance that could be zero. There has been talk of a village-funded pool of dollars to assist property owners in renovations. That's something we should consider. There's a big one that we are going to recommend is zoning flexibility. So this is especially important for homeowners who are on the smaller lots within the village, but it could apply to all lots within the village. If a property owner wishes to update a landmark property and wants to invest in their home, but is being hampered in part by existing zoning regulations, perhaps drainage, perhaps setback, perhaps height, perhaps bulk. We want the village to consider the historic nature of that structure in making decisions around the application of zoning, because we think a couple of minor modifications to an existing zoning provision may allow for a realistic rehabilitation of a historic structure, and we'd rather see that than a tear down of that particular structure. And then we have are working through some other financial incentives to encourage rehabilitation of historic structures. So the answer to that question is absolutely. That is a much more positive direction. It costs the village money, but that will be in our proposal. It's another question. My home is on the list of significant homes. If it is not listed on the Historic Homes of Illinois site, how did it get on this list? So the structures that are on the list were identified by Susan Benjamin and Associates, a historic preservation consulting firm. That's what they do, is work with historic homes and work with municipalities in doing historic surveys of their property, of the homes within their village. The Benjamin folks did surveys in 1998. That was primarily the east side of the village. In 2003, that was primarily the southeast side of the village. In 2008, which I think was the estate survey, and then 2019, which picked up all of the terraces, the west part of the village, and parts of the east side that were missed in current survey. So that's how you're on the list, because the professional historic preservation consultant put it on that list. The Historic Homes of Illinois, that's an organization that does their own analysis of historic structures. We're not involved with them. We look at their input. It is interesting, but it's not part of what we're dealing with for our beginning list. And I think that's all that we have here.
There's a question. Gary, I think, is looking to speak. Gary Doyle.
Hi, thanks, Margaret. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, Gary.
Thank you. I have a question and a comment. My question is, I have a distinguished home plaque on my home at 545 East Scranton Avenue, but I'm not on the list. So I'm wondering why that is. I don't know if it's because of an alteration that was made to it. I'm not sure, but I'm okay with being on the list because I'm a proponent of historic preservation. And my second point is a comment. Thank you for the work you're doing. Stephen, you mentioned the streetscape of Lake Bluff. I'm somebody that feels that the streetscape of Lake Bluff has been compromised over the many years I've lived here by a lack of teeth with our historic preservation regulations. That's a subjective comment, I know, but what's not subjective is we've also lost some great homes because of our lack of enforcement. I'm talking about Blair House, other homes like that. So a question and a comment and a thank you for your work, and I'm glad that you're trying to strengthen these regulations.
Thanks, Gary, for your comment. In terms of your questions, so there's a tab in the list that separately identifies the Distinguished Home Awards from the Lake Bluff History Museum, and you are on that list, as is my house, but neither your house nor my house has been rated as significant in the Benjamin survey. That doesn't mean that you and or I separately couldn't apply for landmark status for our homes. It's just that they haven't been identified as significant. So the History Museum's Distinguished Home Awards are awarded. There are a lot more of them than there are landmarks, and they're awarded to homes based on a different set of criteria. Their criteria dealing with creative rehabilitation, their criteria relating to retaining much of their original facade, for example. Without getting into those in great detail, that list is an interesting list, a nice award to have. I proudly have my DHA award on the outside of my house. But we're dealing in this particular discussion with the significant survey findings from the Benjamin Group.
As a public disclaimer, I should let our audience know that as a board member of the Lake Bluff History Museum, I manage the Distinguished Home Award program. So if you have questions about your Distinguished Home Award plaque, which will either say Lake Bluff History Museum on it, or under our older name, it would say the Vliet Museum on it. If it says that, you wish to get more information, contact me, and I can give you some of the information about the award that you have for your house. So.
Seeing no one else that wishes to comment, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, so let's go into our agenda, and hopefully we'll open this back up for questions as we discuss, after we discuss the potential ordinance changes. So stick in there, and we'd love to answer more questions. The more information we can share about what we're trying to do here and the process that we're trying to go through, the better we think the outcome will be for all the village residents. So agenda number 3 is to discuss the historic preservation regulations. There are 3 pieces to it. The first is commissioners have any feedback for us regarding the feedback that we received during our listening sessions. We had 4 listening sessions over the course of the last month. And we have summaries of those comments dated November 9th and February 24th. To the commissioners, hope you had a chance to look at them. Did we capture what you think the discussions were, both in the written responses and in the responses during our 4 listening sessions? And if you haven't looked at it, there were 4 at least comments that came in within the last an hour or 2 hours before our meeting. So if you didn't look at those comments, take a look at those later. So I'll open it up to any board members who
I had one question about the number of people that participated in those sessions.
Yep.
Or were people counted multiple times?
It's entirely possible. I looked when we started having questions in those meetings. I took a look at the number of participants, and I just wrote it down. I just did it once. So if people were, I know a couple people attended multiple. I know one person attended all 4. But so they would be double counted. Yeah. So it's 50 in total that were, roughly 50 that were participating.
Okay, because I don't think that, I think that's an important distinction, just because we might not have reached critical mass there.
Yeah. I think the first session there were like 27, but after that it was 6 or 7 or 4 or 5.
Yeah, I can pull out the numbers if you're interested and tell you.
That's okay.
The first one was by far the
Right.
The heaviest.
Right.
Did I miss anything here that we heard? I'll tell you what, let me quickly go through the February 24th memo just so that our viewers can, both live and if people are listening to the tape. So in our 4 feedback sessions in the last month, we heard comments that I've summarized related to the landmarking process, related to financial considerations, and related to administrative concerns. In terms of landmarking, we heard at every one of our feedback sessions the concept of certainty, that property owners wanted to know, and the real estate community wanted to know as they were marketing homes, whether or not a property was a landmark and whether or not a property may become subject to landmark status. So, and then communication to property owners is needed. So the communication side is the development of this website. The communication side is reaching out to the homes that are listed as significant in our list, just so they know that they're on that list and we can begin having discussions. And then certainty is what generated the list, because the HPC needs to look at that list and narrow that list down to the structures that we consider really to be anchors. Not that they're not all beautiful, wonderful buildings, but the ones that we would regret the most to see gone. So that's the concept of certainty, and that's candidly why the list was published. Provide more information on what it means to be a landmark? Sure. And as in the next couple of weeks, as we proceed down our path, it is, I think, very critical for us to simplify what it means to be a landmark. What are the positives? We've talked about the incentives we're proposing. What are the potential negatives? And then just some clarifications. We've talked about some of those already. The fact that we're not interested in interiors. There are some folks who have questions still about whether they're interested in interior or not. And then financial considerations around zoning issues especially. There are some concerns that were discussed that a landmark may be designated without the owner's support. That is currently true in the village ordinance. we are suggesting that that remains, but hopefully the application of that is extremely limited. It's been very limited in the past. It has been used primarily in the face, excuse me, of a demolition. So take the Blair property, the Keck and Keck House on the southeast end of Crabtree Farms. That was involuntarily landmarked only after there was a request for demolition. Ultimately, that home was demolished, but that is when in the past the village has involuntary landmarked. It was in the face of a demolition request. Our preference, our sincere preference, is not to have to do that, is to have conversations with residents of historic homes, talking about their beautiful home and how we can help that property owner maintain that home, provide any hints or ideas that we might have, put them in directions for federal tax credits, state tax credits, et cetera. We don't want to involuntarily landmark structures. Unfortunately, just being candid, unfortunately, in some situations, that might be necessary.
But does the recommendation not state that after 3 years, so in the 4th year, following that, they would only be landmarked with, as initiated by the owner?
Yes.
Not quite. So the proposal as it stands, and then we can certainly talk about that tonight if that's something that we're comfortable with. But the way the proposal stands is that 3-year threshold. After 3 years, we have suggested that a property will not be involuntarily landmarked in the face of a demolition. So you're right, if a Keck and Keck or the Blair property comes up 3 years after this ordinance is passed, and if that provision is in the ordinance, if there's a demolition permit for a property that is not already landmarked, we would not landmark it. Okay, that's in there now. What is not in there, although we can discuss it, is whether the village would be comfortable in, after 3 years of review and working with property owners for landmarking, if at the end of that time, a period certain, we would agree to not involuntarily begin the landmarking process for any structure. That's not in there now, but we certainly can talk about it. We've talked about it a bit in the past, but the theory behind that, by the way, is that if we do our job, if this list, the significant list, includes the universe of homes that we may want to consider landmarking, and if we can pair that list to my infamous double handful, and if we can talk to property owners over the next 3 years of the advantages and disadvantages of landmarking, we may not need to have the involuntarily landmark authority after that point in time. That certainly is still an open issue that we should discuss. Okay. So we heard financial considerations. Financial considerations, and one of our questionnaires talked about the potential excessiveness of a 365-day delay. We also had some of the feedback that we had disagreed with our threshold assumption. And my threshold assumption is that a historic designation is a positive. It's something to be proud of. It's something that potentially will attract new buyers who are interested in living in a historic neighborhood and a historic village and a historic home. Some of our commenters in the feedback session saw that not as a positive, but as a potential negative, that people would walk away, they would fear, from a home that contained any historic hindrances to the sales process. And then also on financial considerations, we talked about, our commenters talked about providing financial incentives for preservation and rehabilitation of the housing stock, fee waivers, tax freezes, preservation grants, building flexibility, zoning relief. We agree that those are important, and we will work to itemize and work with the village board to do what we can to make those happen. Recognizing those are dollars output, from the village. I think they're well worth it in encouraging the rehabilitation of our housing stock. We also had a number of administrative concerns. So there is a provision in the existing ordinance that is what we call a 50-year trigger. So any home that is any home in the village, not just ones on the significant list, but any home in the village that is at least 50 years old, for which a demolition or significant alteration permit has been received by the village. Demolition is obvious, you can tear the whole house down. Significant modification is this 50% of the exterior wall area of a home. Right now, if a 50-year-old home has requested a demolition or a significant modification, it flows into a review process by this commission, by the Historic Preservation Commission. We're suggesting that stays, but we are suggesting a process to make that quicker, faster, and be done in less than 30 days. We'll talk about what that is in the next section of our conversation. So we've heard that some of the response that says that's an onerous request. And I know I had the same thing when I did 3 additions to my house. Every one of them, when I finally, signed the contractor statement, I wanted to get started. I didn't want delays. I wanted to just do it, get it over with. And we want people to rehabilitate their home. We want to make that an efficient process administratively. We are recommending the potential for owner-nominated historic districts. And let me emphasize, owner-nominated historic districts. We'll talk about what actually that is and how we suggest it works in a minute. That's a change from what we had originally proposed based on feedback from fellow residents. And we'll talk about what that is. But again, the village could not designate a district, could not do the nomination. That would only come from residents within the proposed district. And then a couple of questions, a couple of comments regarding the eclectic mix of the existing housing stock. Needs to be carefully managed, and some comments, a few around diversity of the housing stock. So is that appropriately summarized?
Yeah, that's good.
Before meeting? Okay. So let's go to the second item of agenda item number, agenda item 3C. So there is a discussion draft in our packet. It's a 2-page draft, and I want to go through this in a fair amount of detail. It talks about, it references our existing proposal, the proposal that went to the village board last year. Village board reviewed, lots of homeowners commented, the village board remanded it back to us for consideration, feedback sessions, and they have asked us to make another request, another proposal. So that's what this will be. If we come to an agreement on these items, if we come to an agreement on changes, then I would like to request that the village work with the village attorney in drafting for our next meeting, March 10th, in drafting a red line version of ordinance changes that we could review in a more formal way on March 10th. So that's why we're doing this here today. So 4 general topical areas for the proposed ordinance changes. The first is how a landmark is designated, so what a landmark, how we do that. The second is, what does a landmark mean, the implications, and this is some of our current speakers tonight had questions about this, so that's the second piece of this, the implications of landmark status. The third are demolitions or alterations to non-landmarks, so the vast majority of structures in the village that are not landmarks. And then the fourth and final preliminary discussion is around historic districts. So I'm going to go through and summarize. I'm going to pause periodically, so if commission members have comments or questions, this is the time to please bring these up. Every comment is welcome. Every comment is great. We've spent years working on this. So what the heck? Let's spend another, 6 months. No, let's. If we can come to consensus, great. If not, then we go back to the drawing.
Steve,
So first, go ahead.
before you start, could you begin with the problem statement? Because I think back in November, there were a lot of letters that asked what problem are we truly trying to solve and to be able to quantify it. And we kind of jumped in today. Could you restate the problem that this ordinance solves for?
Sure. So the problem, quite candidly, the problem is the number of anchors, historic structures that are anchors, that have been lost in the village since this ordinance was passed 15 years ago. The number of structures that added to the character of the village, that made it an attractive place for people to want to live, a number of those are gone. And the problem statement is, at what point do we reach a stage where we are not a historic village, where we've lost the anchors that are reflective of a future time, and we are a very nice village of modern, very wonderful modern homes that people love to live here, but we've lost the historic context that many of us chose when we decided to live here. So that, in effect, is the problem statement. How can we, and I've never mentioned this tonight, I usually start with this, but let me do it right now. This, ultimately, there are no permanent restrictions on property owners. So there are delay periods that may apply to landmarks and non-landmarks, but ultimately the decision of what the property owner wants to do remains with the property owner. There are delays that may apply, but we're not, as many of our neighboring communities are doing, we don't have the power, nor are we proposing the power to veto demolitions or significant alterations to historic structures. We are hoping, and this is one of the reasons to expand the demolition delay, potentially to a whole year, from 180 to 365 days. We hope that for those few situations, because most of the people who own anchors and historic structures in the village are wonderful stewards of the history of the village, are wonderful stewards of the property, are significantly investing in their property and therefore investing in the history of the village, investing in Bluff. The vast majority of people are doing it, are beautifully maintaining their property. But in those few situations where we may have, may be faced, as with the Keck and Keck home and on Crabtree, with the demolition of a structure that we feel was architecturally, socially, culturally significant, the HPC and the village used that time, 180 days they had, to try to find alternatives to save the house. Unsuccessful. That we feel that allowing additional time for those discussions to happen, additional time for community input, additional time for creatively looking at alternatives to demolition are an important part of ensuring that the history of the village, the reason that many of us moved here, will still be there 10 years from now, 20 years from now, 50 years from now. So that's the issue that we're trying to address. Other comments from commissioners? Okay. And I apologize if I get hoarse at the end of today. This is my 4th Zoom call today. Okay, designation of a landmark. So who can apply for a landmark? So the application can be made, and the preferred method of application is by the property owner. But the Historic Preservation Commission or the Village Board can nominate a particular property for landmark status.
And is that the current policy as well as?
Currently, the Lake Bluff History Museum, it can also nominate. We've taken that out. The History Museum agrees that that's not an appropriate role for the museum. So it's the property owner, the HPC, or the village board can nominate. And by far the preferred method is the property owner. So what is potentially landmarked? And the landmark designations apply only to designated portions of the exterior of individual properties, not interior. We may designate only portions, which we have done in the past, only portions of a property that actually are historic. If we've had an old house with an addition, we may landmark only the older portion and not the full. We may do some landscaping, which we've done in the past. We're reluctant to do that, but that is possible under the ordinance. Importantly, it is exterior only, it is not interior. 1C is highlighted because that's new based on this is directly from the feedback of our feedback sessions. And I'm just going to read it. To reduce confusion in future designation of landmarks, the Historic Preservation Commission will publish a list of properties that it will consider for landmark status and will make recommendations to the village board regarding each such property within 3 years of ordinance adoption. The list that was distributed a couple days ago is not this list. The list that was distributed is the universe of properties that we're going to be looking at to make a recommendation to the village board of the smaller list. So it's the starting point, not the ending point. Okay. Another change is that National Register properties are presumed to qualify for landmark status. That's more of a technical change. If a property owner has already gone through national landmarking, we can easily make the presumption that local landmarking processes can begin and work with the property owner on that behalf. Margaret, this is the one with the 4th year. So 1E, beginning in the 4th year after approval of these ordinance changes, only the property owner can submit a landmark application after a demolition permit has been requested. So if we're looking to extend this further, we could say that beginning in the 4th year after approval, only the property owner can submit a landmark application, period. We certainly could say that if we choose. But right now, again, that's not enough. 1F, landmark status is maintained if property ownership changes. So the landmarking goes with property, not with the property owner. So that's why it's critical for future buyers of landmark properties to know that they're buying a landmark, both to exalt in the fact that they are landmark, that they are living in a historic home, but to understand the conditions that landmark status provides. And then finally, 1G, landmark status will end if a landmark property is demolished. Any questions or comments on item 1?
Steve, I have a comment on 1F. We've had, I didn't write down the man's name, but we had a speaker who said he's purchased a house that has been landmarked.
William Schwartz.
William Schwartz, thank you. In Lake Forest and in a lot of other communities, they have what's called the landmark rider that's attached to the closing documents. And there, the realtor is required to include a rider on the closing documents, at least informing the landowner at the very last moment when they get the closing documents that their house is listed as a landmark. And so I'm wondering if we should consider, especially in light of this, Mr. Schwartz's example, if we should consider seeing if we can graft that onto the 1F section of adding the rider. Given the number of landmarks that we have in town, I don't think it's especially onerous to do that, to have a requirement that the realtors do that and have that as part of the village land transfer process.
So, Commissioners? So the idea is that if a property is landmarked, just to make sure that the new property owner understands it is a landmark, that there would be a rider, a legal document that would be required, I guess, right? To be part of the closing process, so that the new property owner would understand and acknowledge that that landmark is fully in effect. It is in effect anyway. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I certainly would, I believe that that's a good idea. Is that something that would be under the purview of HPC to make happen, or who would make sure that those riders get put in?
Good questions. It would not be HPC.
Yeah,
It would be
but we could recommend it to the whatever bodies do that.
Right. I would assume that it would be a village ordinance, that would be included as part of the closing documents.
We also, sorry, Steve. We also talked about this back in the beginning of the HPC about creating a plaque for a home like the History Center does, and it had legs and then it just didn't go anywhere. We never did that, but
but there is a plaque, isn't there, for
I believe Mr. Schwartz discovered that his house was supposed to have a plaque and began inquiring about where's my plaque, and then to his surprise discovered that the plaque was a village plaque and not a Distinguished Home Awards plaque.
Okay.
Gary, the plaque you're referring to is, yes, something that we did do, but the prior landowner took the plaque with them, I guess, or it didn't get mounted or something. So.
So I'm taking a couple of things away from this. One, we need to reach out to our current landmark structures about a plaque or the recognition that they would like to see from this body. It's been long enough that some of those might have gotten lost or never installed. So we need to follow up with that. Glenn, is the existence of a landmark status attached to the property's title?
Yes, so the landmark ordinance, well, I guess I can't say yes. The landmark ordinance is recorded against the property in the Recorder of Deeds office. A title insurance company would discover that in the course of their search. Hopefully you would hope that a seller would disclose it. It's not, I'm not a lawyer. It's not a property right, so I don't think there's anything, to record against a title insurance policy necessarily. Again, I'm not well versed in these things. It surprises me that wouldn't be disclosed to a purchaser. It doesn't necessarily surprise me that wouldn't be in a title insurance policy. But again, I'm no expert at the legalities of these things. I've bought 0 homes in my life.
Glenn, you're absolutely right. It should show up in the homeowner's title insurance policy. It should be flagged by that, and one would think that the buyer's attorney, hopefully, if the buyer, typically a buyer has an attorney, that the buyer's attorney should spot that and flag that for the purchaser.
One other thing I want to add, hopefully when Lake Bluff Online goes live, that will have all that information about landmark designations, which will be really nice and perhaps could be included in packets that go to prospective buyers that would inform them about that. I mean, that would not be our responsibility, but it would be an added avenue for information to be shared.
So I'm going to suggest we keep that as an open item. I would like some feedback from the real estate community that I know is on this call when we get to the end of our section here. I think Lake Bluff Online certainly is the vehicle we want people to look at, and that will very clearly, right now it's a different color if it's a landmark. So all good things. Let's move on to number 2, recognizing that 1F is an open item. So implication of landmark status. So now we're looking at a landmark. Now we're looking at this relatively small number. These are not significant houses. These are homes that have gone through a village landmark process. a very small subset. How many, Glenn? 23?
That sounds right.
23.
Close.
Yeah,
There are
current
23
landmark.
structures, 23 structures in the village that are currently landmarked. There hopefully will be some more, but it's not going to be a huge amount more. So we're not talking about every house on the significant list. So if you're a landmark, here's what happens. So if you're a property owner requests for demolition or significant alteration of a landmark. So you own a landmark, you want to demolish it, you want to significantly change it. There's a potential delay in the issuance of building permits. So this is a building permit delay process. So alterations are subject to review with the HPC, review and discussion of the alteration. And we're recommending a 95-day delay, combination HPC and village board. Most alterations are certainly done in the taste of and style of. I can't think of any alterations that didn't happen because of an HPC review. A demolition, though, so demolition to a landmark.
Before you go to demolition, could you state what the current
current is 60 days, right, Glenn?
That's correct. If it's helpful, I've got a slide handy here.
So current is 60 days, so we're looking just modestly to extend it. And candidly, that's a good question. Candidly, that's a procedural, because sometimes it takes, depending on when the alteration request hits at the village office, it's right before one of our meetings. So sometimes it doesn't even get on the agenda until the second meeting. So pushing it, adding up 30 days is really to deal with that question. The demolition is a different issue. The demolition currently can be delayed by up to 180 days, and we're suggesting, for reasons I discussed before, 365 days. However, we're recommending that the additional time is primarily village board. So there are two steps here. So there's Historic Preservation Commission, which our proposal suggests can delay a demolition permit by 120 days, at which point, if the HPC thinks the delay should be extended, it couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. It would have to go to the village board, to the elected representatives of the village, and they could extend by an additional 245. So recognizing that there is a hesitancy on the part of some property owners in the 365 restriction or demolition delay, the bulk of those days, 245 of those days, would be by vote of the village board, the elected representatives in the village.
Could you talk a little bit about what you hope to accomplish in that delay? Because I think you had said in previous listening sessions, you've talked about getting people's voice heard, like the community voice. And are there not alternative ways to get that scheduled in a more timely manner so that it doesn't need to be extended?
So there are at least two issues that we're trying to deal with in having a demolition delay. The first is the allowing a neighbor, allowing someone who lives in proximity to the potential demolition, allowing someone who walks down that street and enjoys that streetscape and that property, to allow them an opportunity to attend public hearings on the proposed demolition. Currently, if there is a demolition request that is subject to HPC review, there's a sign. We've all seen those in the village, right? There's a sign that goes up, and that's to deal with that issue so that people won't be surprised when a structure is going to be torn down. And the village encourages input at the HPC level for those individual neighbors and village residents who have an opinion and would like discuss with the HPC the potential demolition. So that's one. It's getting many eyes on this. It's getting the input from the community is one piece. And candidly, the current demolition delay does that nicely. There is, we get that input. People come to the village board. People are very good with email messages, voicemail messages to Glenn and to Drew. But what we think we need more time is discussion of alternatives. So if the property owner is willing to think about alternatives, in a lot of situations we found a property owner wants to build a new house, and they're going to build a new house come whatever. But are there ways to save that house that may involve moving it? That may involve incorporating the existing house into the design of a brand new house, which was just done this fall. So that takes more time typically. Potentially looking for a new owner, for a buyer, someone who, especially for certain houses, may be attracted to the process of renovating houses. There are lots of people who do that. So giving as much time as we can, we're suggesting 365, for those discussions to occur. So it's two parts. One is to allow the community, neighbors, to have input, to express their opinion about the proposal. And the second is to work with the property owner to the degree the property owner is willing to look for potential different ways of dealing with the request, with the desire to have a new home. Okay?
There have been landmarked buildings that the village has been responsible for that have been demolitioned, East School as an example. There's a cost associated to maintaining properties that sometimes are just not justifiable. So if that is the case, in a situation like that, now I know it sounds like we're dealing with exceptions to the rule in all of these use cases, but in a situation like that, the delay of a year could be viewed as a penalty because there's a cost to ownership and the end game is still going to be the same. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. East School, by the way, was involuntarily landmarked. There was a demolition permit, and the village wanted to go through a landmarking, primarily to document the history of the building, which is often the reason that landmark discussion happens. In terms of the cost of property ownership, yeah, we recognize, unfortunately, there are certain properties that have deteriorated to the extent that it is probably economically not feasible to renovate the house, and the only realistic opportunity, the only realistic use for that property is a brand new structure. And we recognize that happens. We're always sad about it, especially with landmarks, but we recognize that it happens. But the reason for the discussion is, I'll do a quick story. It's the home that created the Historic Preservation Commission. And that's the home on Center Avenue, on the north side of Center Avenue in the 200 block with the double porch. There was a demolition request for that property. That property, the owners sold to a developer. The developer gutted the interior of the house, took out copper pipes, took everything out. There was a shelf. There was nothing else. And then requested a building permit. And the discussions that occurred with that property, with that developer, first of all, were, I didn't realize this was an important structure within the village. So we're trying to fix that in different ways through education. But the result was that the builder convinced the HPC in the village that that house couldn't be saved. There were problems with that house. So the solution, which the developer came up with, was to build a replica of that home, built to modern standards, and we actually worked with the zoning board in the village so that certain variances were granted to make that building more feasible. So that's one of the reasons the delay, that's an example of how the delay works. The delay works to completely change the concept of the demolition, and they come up with something different, in this case, a replica of the home.
So what is the handshake between the architectural review board or the zoning and the HPC in that scenario? Because I would think the new design would be part of the architectural review board.
Sure. The ABR does not, by policy, review single-family homes. So the architectural review board is not involved in single-family homes at all. So there's no design review within the village for homes. And that surprises, I think, some people.
Yeah.
The handoff to the PCZBA needs to be specific and direct. So I would propose that if we have a property that we're looking to be creative to save the house, that part of the HPC's obligation would be most likely standing with the property owner or developer and talking with the PCZBA about potential options that may be able to save the house or to make a modification more in line with the existing structure. So yeah, there would have to be a recognition, a process in the ordinance that would allow for the transfer of recommendations that already exist. We could, in that situation, pass a resolution that would be taken to the PCZBA. But I think the direct conversation with the PCZBA would be much more likely to be successful. But you're right, there's a handoff.
Steve, in the past, with 210 Center, the HPC formally wrote to the ZBA, and we explained that the zoning variance for the bay window that exceeded the side lot setback, the zoning variance for the height of the porch rails, and I think there's one or two other zoning variances. I think we specifically wrote to the ZBA and said, if this developer will build this house, we directly support these zoning variances. And we listed them. The ZBA wrote us a letter back saying, thank you for your input, and we agree, and we have agreed to follow your input based on the fact that you're the HPC.
Yeah, we can do it in writing. I'd prefer we do it face-to-face, well, assuming we can never meet face-to-face again. But either way, we need to coordinate with them. I think that's a win-win. And I think there are actually lots of situations where that could really act to the benefit of the home, if you get my drift.
We did the same thing with 700 Prospect, where there were the two matching houses the Wesselhoffs lived in for ages and ages. And one of the houses went and got changed around completely, but it has all sorts of front yard and side yard setback variance problems. And we wrote to the ZBA and said, would you please consider this? And they said, thank you, and did. So, I think we need to actively do a lot more of that.
Yep. So the implications of landmark status are these delays, and the reasons for the delays are just as we've talked, to have property owners, neighbors involved in the conversation, expressing their opinion, and to search for alternative solutions other than simply tearing a property down. Property owner retains the right to tear it down if they so choose, but in my view, the longer the time that the village has to have those conversations and to be creative with zoning and design, the more potential success in saving an anchor house that we'll have. Remember, this is only landmark. These only apply to these landmark structures.
And I think it also is an exception, right? Because you've mentioned that many of the landmark owners are good stewards of their properties. So many of them would have already considered the alternatives. Would you agree?
Absolutely. The vast majority of property owners in the village are great stewards of their homes, and that's especially true of landmark homes. When they've gone through the process of landmarking, they've consciously made that decision that they want their home to be a survivor within the village. So it's building off of those. I hate to bring up the boogeyman, but the boogeyman is right. It's the outside developer who comes in, doesn't understand Lake Bluff, wants to come in and make a buck, knows this is a hot real estate market, sees a property, doesn't understand, appreciate, or even care about the structure that's there. They know they've got a design for a house that would look great in a suburb I won't mention that's far west, but looks like crap if it's put down in the village. We don't want that. How do we stop that?
Right.
I mean, to be very candid, that's one of the things we're hoping to be able to do. We won't by policy stop it, but we want to have the conversation for alternatives. And most developers actually are pretty good too. If they realize that there's an alternative to what they're proposing, they want to get this done quickly too. The longer they may have to wait, the more incentives that they have to get this done and to work through the process with the village. But without
that's a bit different problem statement than what we started with, so that's probably worth calling out.
Yeah, I mean, the problem statement is, we could, I think, well, I won't go there. Okay, so the other two pieces of the implications of landmark status are around financial incentives.
Steve, one last point. One last point that I want to get out. The 1-year demolition delay is not out of the ordinary. When we did the survey of demolition delays up and down the North Shore and across the country, 1 year is pretty much of a standard time frame. So I just want to sort of get on the record that this isn't something that we've pulled out of the sky. This is something that a lot of other municipalities employ. So just wanted to... Yeah, and just hopefully reflecting some of the views of our audience and people who have commented that some individuals feel that any demolition delay is an inappropriate restriction on their rights as a property owner. So that natural tension is there, and we're trying to find the right balance between that. So the other part of the implications of landmark status are the financial incentives. Both the state and local reductions, and then the things I identified before that we want the village board to consider, and we hope to work with the village board to put those additional financial incentives, including the zoning flexibility, which I think is really critical, into the process. So any comments on number 2?
Well, I guess my question is about timing. Would we ask that of the village board to have a clear statement about the percent of the reduction of building permits, or possibly a waiver, or who do we go to for possible property tax freezes? Would that all be decided before we would look into these ordinance changes, so that that would be written into the ordinance, or
I think,
how would that work?
The village board will go through its own process to determine. Okay. So what I'm anticipating is that a series of recommendations be either in the ordinance or attached to the ordinance, whatever the attorney says is the most appropriate format, so that the village board knows loud and clear that HPC is recommending, in order to make this all work, is recommending these structures be put in place. The actual amount is to some degree a dollar amount that the village board is willing to invest, and hopefully we can work with them. We can recommend that we jointly work with them to come up with a workable structure. But I think for purposes of the ordinance, the strong recommendation on the part of our group that these incentives be put in place is, I think, where we'll end up.
Okay. Because we'll certainly want to be able to state to potential landmarkers what the actual incentives are.
And there's one more. It's at the top of the second page here. I don't want to miss this one. So if we're going to provide zoning flexibility for developers or homeowners of landmarks who want to work with the village to protect an anchor property, if there's a property owner who just says, nope, I'm not going to work with you, that's their right. They don't have to. They can tear the property down. But I think we should also recommend the other side of the coin, that if you're not interested in working with the village, that it would be unlikely to have variances from the zoning provisions that might make it possible to build a bigger house or to do something different with a particular property. Okay, let me go to number 3. So now we go away from landmarks. Now we're talking about every other structure within the village. So what we talked about currently applies to 23 structures within the village. This applies to every structure in the village. Item 3, as long as those structures are at least 50 years old, and if it's triggered by a demolition permit or a building permit that would be significant, defined as this 50% of the exterior walls, that would trigger a review. So for those homes, 50 years or older, full demolition or significant alteration, there's a review process, and the review process, again, may result in a delay. And under the ordinance as it exists, there is a delay process. What we're suggesting is that the demolition delay process can be delayed for up to 180 days. However, we are also recommending an expedited review process. And this is new. This is a new concept. We acknowledge, and we've talked about this a lot, that, for example, the majority of the terraces, north, east, and west terrace homes, either already are or soon will be approaching the 50-year threshold. And there are lots of property owners who live in the terraces that are looking to do significant changes to their property, which are great and really will add to the housing stock in the village. We dealt with the last alteration we dealt with was exactly one of those situations. The vast majority of those and the vast majority of alterations or demolitions, but primarily alterations, that we've looked at, we have approved in one meeting. We look at it, it's fine. The home is not significant. The property owner wants to make a change. It will enhance the value of the housing stock in the village. They're excited about it. We would love for them to continue. What we don't want, and what 3C hopefully addresses, is for them to have an administrative experience that is not to their liking, that requires a lot of paperwork, that requires a lot of additional time and expense on their part. So we're proposing an expedited review process that has as its threshold. So when would the expedited review process apply? So these are non-landmarks, 50 years old or older, demolition or significant alteration, and a structure that is not significant as rated in our report. So those would be the ones that are triggered, which is the vast majority of structures within the village. If the expedited review process occurs, so if you have a 50-year-old house, demolition or significant review is not landmarked or is not significant, then the process that we've identified here, we can modify this, but the process that's used in a couple of local suburbs, our neighbors, if the expedited review is triggered, the review is examined by the chair of the HPC. If the chair determines and in writing certifies that the demolition or significant alteration request is not contradictory to the objectives of the historic preservation ordinance, then the appropriate permit may be issued. If the chair does not so determine, then the HPC, then it goes through the regular process. So the expedited review process gives the chair the authorization for these category of homes to, in effect, approve the issuance of a building permit within days after that request has been made. So this is trying to fulfill the less than 30-day process. Questions? It doesn't have to be the chair. It could be a designated member of the commission. It needs to be a member of the commission. It could be 2 people of the commission. It could be, you know, something other. The chair seemed easiest.
I think it's a really great idea, you know, that we don't need to put a lot of people through the process if you can take a look at it, or if a group or someone can take a look at it and make that decision ahead of time.
Yeah, and the reality is, individuals who are doing this, who want to put a big addition on their house, are all excited about doing it. They've never dealt with a village about this building permit stuff before, and they're nervous that there's all kinds of nonsense that's going to happen, and we're going to be picky, and we're going to tell them you can't do it, or you have to change it. And that's not what we do. We, you know, so we want to make this as clear and simple as we can.
And
Go ahead. Well, I think there's also an element of, we're a pretty small village. You know, we don't have that many houses. We don't have a huge budget. We don't have a lot of business to slush funds, lack of the right terminology. Our property taxes are what are driving our village budget. So we don't have a lot of extra to create layers. So anything that we can do to streamline a process, or even create those transparencies on the checklist, that I think is something probably everybody on this call would celebrate.
I agree.
Oh, okay, great. So let me quickly go through number 4, because I know we're starting to run out of time here. Number 4 are historic districts. So let me quickly run through what we're proposing, and this again has changed from the original presentation. So this proposal suggests that related properties within the village, related is a key because they need to be linked together cohesively, thematically, conceptually, historically. There needs to be a reason for having a district. But related properties may be designated as historic districts, recommended by HPC, approval by the village board. However, applications for historic districts can be made only by 1 or more property owners within the proposed district. So you have to be a property owner, you have to live within the district in order to make the application. No one else can. And I think that was a clear request from the feedback sessions that we've received. And we've added one more hoop here for these proposed districts. The application shall include written support of the lesser of 10 owners or 50% of the owners within the proposed district. So the idea here is we want to facilitate a group of like-minded neighbors to create a level of protection for their neighborhood. And in order to do that, they need to nominate, and there needs to be a significant portion of the owners in this proposed district who agree with the nomination process to begin with. So if that nomination is made, meets those thresholds, and by the way, it's 10 owners or 50% because we could have large or small districts, so it kind of tries to cover both of them. So if, to the degree that there is an application, we would work with the applicant to help them identify the district, to help them put the application in place. And we would, and every structure within the district would be identified in the ordinance that HPC would pass as contributing to the historic integrity of the district or non-contributing to the integrity of the district. And that distinction is important because of the impact of potential future changes. So if the owner, group of owners really, submits an application, if the HPC agrees and helps them work through the contributing, non-contributing nature of it, the HPC would vote on the application and would recommend to the village board that the property owners vote on the application. So the way the old proposal worked is that there was an application that went to the HPC, then it went to the village board for a vote, then it went to the property owners for a final vote. This takes the village board vote at the end after the residents have had a chance to vote. Seems more logical to me. So nomination, HPC approval, property owners vote, and this can be changed, but we're suggesting that the threshold for approval is if at least 50% of the property owners vote and a majority of those voting affirm. So if you have half of the people, the property owners in the district voting, and a majority of those voting say yes, then the village board gets to approve or disapprove. It goes to the vote of the village board. That 50% could be different, could be higher, probably wouldn't be lower. And then quickly, the implications for a historic district. So historic district then elevates the structures within that district to the status of a landmark. Requests for demolition or alteration are reviewed by the HPC. If a contributing structure within the district is recommended, if the owner of a contributing structure, pre-identified contributing structure, wants to demolish or significantly change, then the HPC reviews it using the rules for a landmark. So it's just like that structure has been landmarked. If it's non-contributing, then the HPC reviews it using the rules of a non-contributing structure, of a non-landmark. So in effect, we've created, using the same review processes that we have for landmarks and non-landmarks, we've simply attached those review processes and the implication, the delay, to contributing and non-contributing structures within a district.
Can you define like contributing versus non-contributing again?
That would be done, so contributing and non-contributing are defined in National Register district language. We would need to look and see if that's appropriate for use, but it would be a higher standard. So just like the Benjamin surveys identify significant contributing and non-contributing using their own formulas, the developers of the district would need to specify contributing and non-contributing structures. So the contributing structures, to use other terminology, are the anchors of the district, and the non-contributing structures are contributing but are not as important as the anchors within that proposed district. They would be specified, every structure in the district would be specified contributing and non-contributing before the HPC would vote and before the property owners would vote and before the village board would vote. Okay, do we have, let me open it up for comments from participants. Do we have anyone who has comments or questions? We still have 13 left.
Steve, I do have one that I wanted to clarify. When we're talking about the 50% voting, is that 50% of the households? Is that counting the number of houses in the district, or is that counting the number of homeowners in the district?
No, it's properties.
Properties, okay.
Yeah.
So one vote per property.
So one vote per property, and if they fight about it, we're not going to get involved. There was someone who wanted to ask a question.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Ann Caldwell calling.
Hi, Ann.
Hello. So I just wanted to clarify a couple of things so that I have my understanding correct, and maybe this would help some other people as well. I live in an historical home. I did apply for historic landmark status and was granted that. And I see that as adding to the value of my home. And it also serves as an incentive for me as someone who cares and loves about Lake Bluff and the character that these historic homes lend to our community. I see it as encouragement to be a good steward of this old home. And I also think that the investments that I make in the house are going to increase its marketability. So I was a little confused to hear somebody earlier propose that maybe landmark status would lower the market value of their home, because I was thinking that the historic status would really affect its appeal to potential buyers. And the only buyer that would maybe discourage would be a buyer that is eyeing the house for demolition. And that would be a buyer that hopefully anyone who's invested and has been a steward of their old home would not even be interested in selling their home to. I mean, I really would not want to sell my home to someone who intends to tear it down after all the hard work I've put into it. So I would, and I've also heard that villages and communities and municipalities that have enacted an historic preservation design like this, that their market values have increased. Can you speak to that?
I can try. First of all, thank you for investing in Lake Bluff, living in the landmark, and being a good steward of your property. It's sort of the dream we all have, that our anchor properties are owned by folks just like you. And there are lots of people, and I'll say us because I essentially believe the same thing that you do, that properly applied historic preservation long-term benefits the property owner and the village and future property owners. However, I do recognize the concerns that people have about more difficulty that may be applied to selling a home with a historic label. I do know, and we've talked quite a bit with real estate brokers, that there are people who come into Lake Bluff and they tell the brokerage community, don't you show me a historic home. I don't want to see anything that has any restrictions applied at all. I'm not going to buy it. And some people say we've got to respect that and we've got to make this a welcoming place for everybody. Other people say, well, okay, if that's how you feel, then, just recognize that this is a community that values historic homes. So we recognize divergent points of view. We're trying to find a methodology that will work to preserve our anchors, preserve our history, but still provide the flexibility that homeowners need, especially at certain points in their life. So we're not struggling, but we've spent 3 years trying to work through those issues. In terms of, are there studies showing the effect of historic designations on property owners? The answer, unfortunately, it depends on your point of view. If you believe in historic districts, if you believe in historic landmarking, you can find lots of literature that indicates that average values increase over time. These are all longitudinal studies. That the value of a historic home in a historic place is greater than a non-historic home in a different place. There are other people who start from a different perspective, that historic landmarking is an intrusion on property rights, and they can find cases where historic landmarking hasn't done anything with respect to property values. So there are both points of view, and I think you can find statistics to provide both of them. The view of the HPC is that there is benefit in recognizing our history, that there is benefit in maintaining the historic character of the village, that it attracts certain people who are attracted to historic homes as you were, as I was, and that if we lose too many of these anchor structures, we're going to lose the cohesiveness, the sense of place, the built environment that attracts individuals who are predetermined to value historic structures. So I hope that's answered your question as best as I can.
Thank you.
Can I ask one question? Were you able to landmark your home, or was it landmarked? Was it initiated by the village?
Oh, I just one moment, please.
Is that for Dan?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I applied for the landmark status.
Thank you.
Do we have other folks that wish to comment?
Stephen, I wanted to underline something that you said, and some of this I think is pertains to the information that's presented to people, when these regulations are presented to them. You said that the waiting period for a demolition of a significant structure in Lake Bluff, one of the resolutions is to double that. And a lot of people would hear that here and go, my gosh, that sounds like a abrupt change. But as you said, all that does is catch us up to what every other North Shore town does. And so my point is that I think when this information is put out, some of that context would help. This is not anything exceptional. This is merely putting us on par with other North Shore towns. We've, Landmarks Illinois, a historic preservation, entity, has rated Lake Bluff in the past the weakest North Shore town for historic preservation. And that's one reason why. So I'm just, suggesting that as this information is imparted, that kind of context is also included. It's not drastic, it's just for the North Shore, par for the course.
Thanks, Gary. We do have, Glenn has put together a comparison of a variety of North Shore suburbs that certainly will be part of a master information that will be distributed. Thanks. Okay, we're getting close to 8 o'clock. What I would like to do is ask the commissioners if they're comfortable with these changes. So remember that if we're comfortable enough that we want the village attorney to draft revisions to the ordinance so that we can look at those and discuss them in 2 weeks, then we need to do that today. It doesn't mean we can't make changes. But if people are generally comfortable, if you could tell me with that, if there are areas that you'd like to see changed, if you could give us a quick what you'd like to see as options, and we can ask the attorney to provide some options for us to discuss next meeting.
Steve, I'm very comfortable with what you've put together so far. I think we've been on a very long road. We've looked at so many of these issues, and now we have the benefit of the direct public input at a pretty intense level. We've gotten the attention of the realtor community, and we've gotten their input. So I'm very comfortable with what we have so far. I think this would be great, and I think I'm ready to move forward.
Okay.
I'm comfortable as well. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's taken a lot of work, and I think we're at a good place.
Margaret, I know you have some time.
I would say that I think the residents still seem to have a lot of questions. So I think the process of getting started is good, but I think we need to continue to hear what residents are saying and address the concerns and maybe make additional edits to the proposal.
Okay, yeah, and that's what the next meeting really is all about, is to have those kind of edits.
I think as long as we keep in mind that we are trying to represent the residents, we've talked about the fact that more than the majority, our community is pretty special, and that we're really trying to address exceptions to those anchor, as you phrase it, anchor properties. If there's ways to still address that, but reduce the limitations or perceived limitations to residents and their that would be ideal.
Okay. perhaps we can, or as you think through this, perhaps we can chat, or you can chat with Drew or Glenn about some specific ideas around how to make that happen. We do represent
Yep.
all of the community. We do need to recognize people are coming at this from different perspectives and try to
Yep.
find something that, that is palatable. Thanks.
Yep.
Lois?
Yes, I really like the process that we've been through for a year or two in developing all of this, and I think that even in the last couple of months, we've gone through a lot of changes, particularly with modifying the historic districts and hearing what people had to say and making changes accordingly. I do agree with Margaret that we still need to continue to listen to the village. And one thing I've learned from this too is that it won't stop when the new ordinance changes go into effect. That's going to be an ongoing work of ours to continue to work with the community. I would like to see some attention to the incentives. And I don't really know exactly what that means and what kind of specificity there can be with our recommendations, but just get a little better idea of like what we're going to be recommending.
I think that's a great idea, and I would hope that Glenn, through his contacts, and village attorney through his firm's contacts, could give us some examples of what other communities, North Shore communities, or communities of a similar size and history, what they're doing with respect to incentives. That would be great for us to look at.
Because we've talked throughout, and one of the things that community members have said is to not focus on the punitive piece, which I don't see this punitive, but we really need to focus on the incentives. Yeah.
Okay.
Mr. Chair.
Jane?
I apologize.
Yeah.
Oh, I would just note that we did undertake that investigation back in October. We actually found that other North Shore communities do not offer local incentives. So the only examples we were able to find was that the city of Chicago waives building permits completely. In Cook County has a home rule property tax classification. I think I'm right when I say home rule. I'm not positive, but a special property tax classification for rehabilitation. And then we in Lake Bluff have our 25% building permit reduction. So we're happy to bring you what we can about possible incentives, but just wanted to highlight that that information is out there as well in the October meeting packet.
Okay. I don't know if it's possible, but my guess is that, and I'm thinking of properties recently in the news where, in one case, a Frank Lloyd Wright house was moved after village, the person wanted to demolish it, they moved it. And that was done in conjunction with either the local history society or with the preservationist group. So if there's any way, Glenn, to get insight into what communities, recognizing the community governments aren't funding this, but to what degree that support groups, let's say historic preservation support groups within those communities may be doing to assist in the preservation of their own anchored structures. Might be hard to find, but that's a good place to think. Okay, Janie, last.
Well, I agree with what Lois said. I just feel like we've been working on this for years, and there's no way to make 100% of the people in Lake Bluff happy about what we decide to do, but to try and emphasize what's positive and de-emphasize what's punitive, which is the slowdown in demolition and sort of that sort of thing, is the way to go. And I could also put in the education part of that. I think putting some sort of a rider into the closing documents on any recognized home is the minimum thing we should do. But to educate the community about what landmarking does mean and what it does not, because I think there's still a lot of confusion about that, is an important thing to do.
Okay. Glenn, do we need a motion, or is this sufficient to request you and the village attorney to work on an ordinance draft?
I don't think a motion is necessary. I think we're hearing what we need to hear. So I think we can bring you some options at your March meeting.
Okay. So let's do that. The item that we're, as I suspected, are not going to talk a lot about is the list. What I'd like, now that we have the list, I'd like all of the commissioners over the next 2 weeks to think about these structures that are identified, these wonderful, significant structures within the village, and think of them as anchors within the village. Which of these would you just cry if they were torn down? Maybe that's the best way to think about it. Which of these do we just need to keep? And I'd love to have a discussion. We will have a discussion about what those are. This list needs to be narrower so that we can prioritize our discussions with residents based on some more knowledge. So if you're working on those lists and you need more information about a particular property, work through Glenn, or actually look on the history walk, because most of these homes have more information in the history walks. Not all of them, but most of them do. But I would like all of us to take a look at that and discuss as the second item on the agenda next month. Glenn, do we have any?
Can I ask a question? Would it be appropriate to ask the residents that participated tonight or listened in if they feel as though their voice or point of view has been heard or represented?
You mean right now? Certainly.
They don't need to respond right now, but if it has or hasn't, that they provide the feedback either now or in writing or by phone.
Sure. I'm hopefully we've been predictable in the fact that we're trying to get as much input as we can. We're trying to be, I hate the word transparent, but that's what we're trying to be. We're trying to be reflective of the different starting points within the village. I recognize, I've talked with quite a few people, that some people are coming at this totally differently than others, and we're trying to balance all of those. So absolutely yes, to the degree that people who have listened in or will be listening in on tape have additional comments, or they have opinions as to what we've discussed, very interested in whether we've met your concerns, very interested in if there's still additional concerns after this meeting. So absolutely would like to get as much input as possible from everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else from the commissioners or any audience member? Look at that. It's 8:01. I'm sorry. I said we're going to end at 8. It's going to be 8:01. I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Paul with a move, Sherry with a second. Roll call vote, please.
Certainly, Member Bergman.
Yes.
Member George.
Yes.
Member Minor.
Yes.
Member Nickel.
Yes.
Member Richardson.
Yes.
Chair Kraus.
Yes, thank you. We'll see you in 2 weeks, and thanks to everyone in the audience for their comments.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
for all the work you've done on this project.
Yeah, it's tremendous. Thank you so much.
You bring Laura on, and you've been the narrator through all of these public meetings we've had. You've represented all of the information. I think it's just a beautiful format. You've done a fabulous job, and so I want to give you a little round of applause.
Besides the hundreds and hundreds of hours you put in at home on all of this for us.
Okay, I'm gonna go gargle now. Take care, everybody.
Good night,
Enjoy the
everyone.
weather.
Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye-bye.